In the heart of the dense ancient forest known as Widow's Vale, a place steeped in dark folklore, lies an abandoned village called Eldergrove. Once a thriving settlement, it is now nothing more than a collection of decaying buildings and overgrown paths. Locals speak in hushed tones about the village, warning anyone who dares to listen about the curse that plagues it. This is the story of the widow's ghost. The legend begins in the 1800s with a woman named Eliza Ravenscroft. Eliza was the wife of the village blacksmith Henry, and she was known for her beauty and kindness. However, their happiness was short-lived. One fateful night, Henry went missing. The villagers searched the woods and the surrounding areas, but he was never found. Eliza was heartbroken and refused to believe he was gone. She spent her days wandering the village and the forest, calling out for her lost husband. As months turned into years, Eliza's grief transformed into madness. She claimed to see Henry in the shadows, whispering to her, begging her to join him. The villagers grew wary of her, whispering that she was cursed. One stormy night, Eliza disappeared. Her house was found in disarray, a single note left behind. "I have found him. We are together once more." From that night on, strange occurrences began to plague Eldergrove. The villagers spoke of seeing Eliza's ghost, a pale figure clad in a widow's black dress, wandering the streets in the forest, her mournful wails echoing through the night. Children went missing, and those who ventured into the forest rarely returned. Those who did come back were changed, their eyes hollow, their spirits broken. Eldergrove was soon abandoned, left to rot and be reclaimed by nature. Decades passed, and the story of the widow's ghost became a cautionary tale, a local legend meant to scare children. But some stories have a way of luring the curious and the brave. That's where I come in. My name is Alex, and I am a paranormal investigator with a penchant for exploring the unknown. When I heard about Eldergrove and the legend of the widow's ghost, I knew I had to see it for myself. It was a crisp autumn day when I set out for Widow's Vale. The forest was dense, the trees towering and the path barely visible. As I ventured deeper, the canopy thickened, and the air grew colder. The village of Eldergrove emerged from the gloom, a ghostly remnant of its former self. The buildings were skeletal, the windows shattered, and the streets overrun with vines and weeds. I set up my equipment in what remained of the village square: a digital recorder, an infrared camera, and a motion sensor. The sun was setting, casting long, eerie shadows across the ruins. As darkness fell, the silence was almost palpable, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. Hours passed with no activity, and I began to think the legend was just that, a legend. But then, at midnight, the air grew frigid, and a thick fog rolled in, shrouding the village in a ghostly veil. My breath came out in visible puffs, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The motion sensor beeped, indicating movement. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it towards the source of the disturbance. There, emerging from the mist, was the figure of a woman. She was dressed in a tattered black dress, her hair flowing like a dark waterfall. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were hollow, filled with an eternal sorrow. "Eliza?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure paused, turning to face me. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. She began to glide towards me, her feet not touching the ground. Panic set in, but I stood my ground, determined to document this encounter. As she approached, I felt an overwhelming sense of despair. My mind was flooded with images: Henry's disappearance, Eliza's descent into madness, and her final night. Her sorrow and desperation were palpable, as if she was trying to communicate with me, to make me understand her eternal suffering. "Why are you here?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Her hollow eyes bore into mine, and suddenly I was no longer in Eldergrove. I was in the forest witnessing Henry's last moments. He had been attacked by a dark, malevolent force, dragged into the depths of the woods. Eliza had followed, trying to save him, but she too was consumed by the darkness. Their spirits were trapped, bound to the village and the forest by an ancient, evil curse. I snapped back to reality, Eliza's ghost now inches from me. Her cold hand reached out, grazing my cheek. "Help us," she whispered, her voice a mere echo. I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "I will," I promised, not fully understanding what I could do, but feeling an overwhelming need to free them from their torment. Eliza vanished, the fog lifting as quickly as it had appeared. The temperature rose and the oppressive feeling dissipated. I gathered my equipment, my mind racing. I knew I had to break the curse, but how? Over the next few days, I researched tirelessly, uncovering the dark history of Widow's Vale. The curse dated back centuries, to a time when a coven of witches was executed in the very forest that surrounded Eldergrove. Their dying breath had cast a curse upon the land, condemning the souls of the village to eternal suffering. To break the curse, I needed to perform a ritual at the site of the executions, using symbols and incantations from the witches' own grimoires. Armed with this knowledge, I returned to Widow's Vale, determined to free Eliza and Henry. The forest was even more foreboding the second time. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the very trees were watching. I reached the clearing where the witches had been executed, the ground still marked by dark, twisted roots. I set up a circle of salt and candles, placing the grimoire in the center. As I began the incantation, the wind picked up, howling through the trees. Shadows danced around the circle, and the air grew cold once more. I could feel the presence of the witches, their anger and pain palpable. I continued the ritual, my voice steady, despite the fear gnawing at my insides. A dark, swirling mist rose from the ground, forming the spectral figures of the witches. They stared at me with hollow eyes, their mouths moving in silent curses. I held my ground, finishing the incantation with a final, desperate plea for forgiveness. The witches screamed, a sound that echoed through the forest before dissolving into the mist. The ground shook, the twisted roots retracting, and a blinding light enveloped the clearing. When it faded, the oppressive darkness was gone, replaced by a serene stillness. I returned to Eldergrove, feeling a sense of peace. The village, though still in ruins, no longer felt haunted. I knew the spirits of Eliza and Henry were finally free. To this day, Eldergrove remains abandoned, a testament to the horrors that once plagued it. The legend of the widow's ghost has faded into obscurity, but the memory of that night remains with me. Some curses run deep, but even the darkest shadows can be brought to light. If you ever find yourself near Widow's Vale, remember my story. Some places are haunted not by spirits, but by the echoes of the past. In the sleepy town of Raven's Hollow, there existed a legend that no one dared to speak of after dark. The tale of the Mirror Man. The story goes back decades, originating from an old mansion on the outskirts of town. This mansion, known as Blackwood Manor, was said to be cursed, its halls filled with sorrow and despair. And at the center of it all was the Mirror Man, a spectral figure who could only be seen in reflections. It all began with the tragic story of a man named Samuel Blackwood, the last heir of the Blackwood family. Samuel was a renowned artist, obsessed with capturing the human soul in his portraits. His fixation led him to experiment with mirrors, believing they could trap the essence of a person. However, his obsession took a dark turn when his wife, Eleanor, mysteriously disappeared. Samuel claimed she was trapped in one of his mirrors, but no one believed him. He was found dead in front of his favorite mirror, his face twisted in terror. Blackwood Manor was abandoned after his death, but the legend of the Mirror Man persisted. They say that if you stand before the mirror in Samuel's old studio at midnight, you can summon the Mirror Man. Driven by curiosity and the desire to debunk the myth, I decided to investigate. It was a cold, moonless night when I arrived at Blackwood Manor. The mansion stood like a specter against the dark sky, its windows broken and its once grand facade covered in ivy. I pushed open the heavy wooden door, which groaned in protest, and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of decay permeated the halls. Armed with a flashlight and a camera, I made my way to Samuel's studio. The room was just as I imagined. Easel and brushes scattered, canvases covered in dust, and in the center of the room, the infamous mirror. It was tall and ornate, with a gold frame that had tarnished over the years. The surface of the mirror was cloudy, as if holding secrets of its own. I set up my camera on a tripod, ensuring it had a clear view of the mirror. I checked my watch, 11:55 p.m. I had 5 minutes before midnight. As I waited, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the old mansion settling. At the stroke of midnight, I stood in front of the mirror, my heart pounding. "Mirror Man," I called out, my voice trembling slightly. "If you're real, show yourself." For a moment, nothing happened. I felt a wave of relief, convinced that the legend was just a story. But then, the room grew colder, and my breath came out in visible puffs. The mirror's surface began to ripple, like water disturbed by a pebble. My reflection twisted and morphed, and then I saw him. A shadowy figure standing behind me in the mirror. I spun around, but the room was empty. I turned back to the mirror, and there he was, closer now. The Mirror Man's face was obscured, but his eyes were unmistakable, cold, dark, and filled with malice. He reached out a hand, and I felt an icy grip on my shoulder. I tried to move, but I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot by an unseen force. The Mirror Man leaned in closer, his whisper echoing in my mind. "You shouldn't have come here." Desperate to escape, I summoned all my strength and broke free from the invisible hold. I grabbed the camera and bolted from the room, my footsteps echoing through the empty halls. I could hear him following, his whispers growing louder, more frantic. "You can't escape. You belong to the mirror now." I burst out of the mansion and into the cold night air, not stopping until I reached my car. I drove away, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I didn't stop until I was back in the safety of my apartment. It was only then that I dared to review the footage. The video showed me standing before the mirror, calling out to the Mirror Man. The mirror rippled and the shadowy figure appeared. But as I watched, my blood ran cold. The camera had captured more than I had seen. As I ran from the room, the Mirror Man stepped out of the mirror, his form becoming more solid with each step. The last frame showed him standing in the doorway, watching me leave. Terrified, I deleted the footage and tried to convince myself it was all a hallucination, a trick of the mind. But the nightmares began that very night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him, standing in the shadows waiting. His whispers filled my mind, telling me I could never escape. Days turned into weeks, and the nightmares grew worse. I started seeing him in every reflective surface, mirrors, windows, even puddles of water. His presence was inescapable, his whispers a constant torment. I tried to avoid mirrors covering them or breaking them, but it was futile. He was always there, lurking just beyond the surface. To this day, I warn others to stay away from Blackwood Manor. The legend of the Mirror Man is real, and some spirits are best left undisturbed. If you ever find yourself tempted to investigate, remember my story. Some mirrors should remain broken, and some shadows are best left in the past.